Hello everyone! This video is going to be about asexual exclusion from the LGBT community. As I will be addressing the arguments for and against the exclusion of asexual people, I am going to be delving into discussions of oppression and its ramifications. So, here is a content warning. This video is going to contain discussions of sexual and physical violence as well as suicide. So, if you are not comfortable with those topics, please refrain from watching. One thing I'd like to clear up here at the start is that I am arguing specifically that all asexual people should be considered part of the LGBT community. Most of the people arguing against this do consider asexuals who are trans or non-binary to be part of the community, as well as aces who aren't romantically straight, meaning they are romantically attracted to people of the same gender, two genders, or all genders. With this video, though, I am specifically arguing that all asexuals, including those who are hetero or aromantic, should be included in the community. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to specify this throughout the length of the video because that'd get a bit repetitive. To begin, I'm going to start with a video by Calvin Guerra, everyone's favorite LGBT exclusionist, titled "Asexual is not LGBT," with lots of little exclamation marks there to make sure you know that he's serious. And no, before you ask, I'm not going to be talking about the transmedicalist stuff. Not yet. Now, for convenience's sake, with both of the videos that I'll be addressing, I am going to be playing some of the clips out of order as both of the people making them tended to circle back to similar points from time to time. In order to dispel any suspicions of cherry-picking and the like, feel free to watch the original videos as I have linked them both in the description. Following nearly a full minute of asking people to follow and subscribe to him, Calvin starts actually talking about the issue at hand, beginning with his opinions on asexuality, which are held independently of how he feels about ace inclusion.
I think that, although asexuality isn't a choice, I think that it is rooted in the brain, either sex repulsion or entire sex repulsion, meaning you literally cannot even look at people having sex.
So there was a 2016 study which found that asexuality tends to be a lifelong pattern, therefore making it inconsistent with the characteristics of a trauma response. Along with this, the DSM-5 specifically notes that being uninterested in sex is not inherently a mental disorder or sexual dysfunction. Quote, "If a low sexual desire is better explained by self-identification as asexual, then a diagnosis of HSDD or arousal disorder is not made." And while asexual people do have a higher rate of anxiety disorders than the general population, as well as a rate of suicide attempts 4% higher even than the general rate among LGBT youth, that same study concluded that this is not, in fact, due to mental disorder or dysfunction. Quote, "The available evidence seems to suggest that those feelings are a result of prejudice and discrimination against asexuals." Now, before you finish your comment about how ace folks don't experience any discrimination, I am going to get to that. I'm not getting to it right now, but I will get to it. Just wait until I've said my piece, and then you can write your angry comment, okay? Back to Calvin for now.
Or is like a sex-positive asexual, so you don't experience that sexual attraction, but you still have sex, which I have opinions on that as well. It's like, okay, well, everybody experiences attraction to a different degree. All of us experience sexual attraction differently.
Being sexually active does not disqualify someone from being considered asexual. To quote Dr. Michael Yates, a clinical psychologist specializing in sexual health, "Sexual attraction is a motivation to engage in sexual activities with another person. It is possible to still have a sexual drive, but for that not to be directed at another person." Basically, not being sexually attracted to people does not mean that you don't experience arousal or have a sex drive. Now, I'm going to do a little thought experiment here, but just bear with me and play along, okay? If you masturbate, I want you to close your eyes and think about what you use to do so. Are you sexually attracted to that thing? When you think of your hand, or your vibrator, or your fleshlight, or your pillow, or whatever else, do you experience the same sexual desire that you would attribute to someone you normally would find sexually attractive? Well, unless you're autocheirophilic, I highly doubt that you do. The thought experiment is over now. You can open your eyes. So we've established now that sexual arousal and activity, at least within the context of masturbation, can occur independently of sexual attraction. This can also occur with sexual intercourse itself. There are quite a few gay and lesbian people who, prior to realizing that they were, in fact, not straight, were in straight relationships with the opposite gender. Many, albeit not all of these people, in these relationships did, in fact, have and enjoy sex with their partners, despite the fact that they weren't attracted to them. After all, if one doesn't have to be sexually attracted to a masturbatory aid in order to become aroused for masturbation, one needn't necessarily be sexually attracted to the other person in order to have sex either. A lesbian having sex with a man or a gay man having sex with a woman isn't made a bi or pansexual person due to having or enjoying ostensibly straight sex. The same can be said of asexual people. If sex can be had and enjoyed independently of sexual attraction by allosexual people, it stands to reason that the same thing should also be true of asexuals.
And don't even get me started on demisexuality. That's just like, to me, I'm always like, well, I'm demisexual then, because I don't want to with people that I'm not dating.
So I'm not going to fault Calvin for this one, because this is quite a common misconception about what demisexuality actually is. Demisexuality isn't only wanting to have sex with people one is in a relationship with, but is only being sexually attracted to people with whom one has an extremely strong emotional connection. While those things might at first seem to be synonymous, I assure you that they are not. For demisexual people, this connection needn't be a romantic one. In fact, there doesn't even have to be a romantic relationship at all for a demisexual person to develop that sexual attraction. What most demisexual people will tell you, though, is that this attraction needs a very strong emotional connection. And this connection can take months or even years to become strong enough. I'll use a friend of mine as an example. She has only ever been sexually attracted to 2 people. In both of these cases, she was unbelievably close to the person well before she felt any sort of sexual attraction for them. One of them had been a close friend since childhood, and she only felt sexual attraction to them after having been that close for over a decade and a half. And with the other, they had been in a romantic relationship for 8 years, and had been best friends for 4 years preceding that, before she felt any sort of sexual attraction for him. While the amount of connection required differs from person to person, the fact of the matter is that demisexuality isn't only wanting to have sex with people one is dating, it's a lot more complicated than that. Now that we've got that squared away, on to the actual discourse at hand.
So you have your sexual attraction and your romantic attraction. And I would say asexual and aromantic are both things that would not make you LGBT. Let's say you are asexual and aromantic. I still wouldn't consider you LGBT. Just because you're not interested in dating anybody and you're not interested in anybody, that doesn't mean that you're LGBT. Again, I don't think asexuality is a choice, but to me, being asexual is in a different realm. Like, it's not the same thing. Like, it's kind of like just something about your brain. You're just not interested in having sex.
Well, since we've already talked about how it isn't, in fact, just something about your brain, I'll talk about that argument that being asexual isn't LGBT because it's a different thing entirely to being, say, bisexual. That 2016 study I quoted earlier is actually entirely centered around trying to figure out what, in fact, asexuality is. The study concluded, and I quote, that asexuality is a heterogeneous entity that likely meets conditions for a sexual orientation. They came to this conclusion due to the following 5 criteria, some of which I already touched on. 1. Asexuality is a lifelong condition/pattern which makes it inconsistent with the notion that it comes out of a response to trauma. 2. Asexuality has statistically significant biomarkers in a manner similar to other sexual orientations. 3. Asexuality tends to be evident early in life. 4. Asexuals display a consistent lack of motivation for sex. And 5. Asexuality tends to be stable over time. Now, to address number 4 there, they're not saying that asexuality inherently means that one has no motivation for sex, but rather that the motivation they feel is not specifically for sex. Asexual people can and sometimes do have sexual relationships with other people, but they don't really seek out relationships with sex as their primary motivation for doing so. So, in case you forgot due to my rambling, Calvin said,
to me, being asexual is in a different realm. Like, it's not the same thing.
The same thing here being non-straight sexualities. Well, if you look at, the researchers actually studying asexuality, it is, in fact, the same thing, since it's both asexuality and not a straight one. So, since it is actually a sexual orientation, why would people be against including it in the LGBT community? To answer that question, I think it's time that I introduce today's other video, Asexuals Are Not LGBT, from the channel Ren Rants. Now, one thing that is frustratingly common in response videos done in bad faith is that people will often choose videos from smaller channels or videos with exceptionally angry people, as it's easier to dismiss the arguments of people with, quote-unquote, less clout, and it's easier to dismiss people's arguments if they're angry. With regards to the size of Ren's channel, I'd like to point out that, as it stands, her channel is significantly larger than mine, but is still relatively small. Normally, I wouldn't include a video from a creator of this size, as I wouldn't want to direct negative traffic their way, but the fact of the matter is that hers is the only video on ace inclusion that actually makes any points regarding the reasons people have for excluding ace folks, and I figured it would be better to include examples of someone actually making these arguments, instead of me just claiming that they have in some nebulous space been made. Regarding the fact that Ren is quite angry in this video, I would ask that you please not hold that against her. This is a very heated topic for quite a lot of people, myself included. In fact, the entire reason that I'm doing this video in the style of Sean is because I myself get quite heated about this, and emulating a famously level-headed and calm creator is a way that I can make sure that I keep from getting too mad. So, getting back to the point at hand, why would people be against including asexuality in the LGBT community?
If you lack sexual attraction to someone, nobody's discriminating against you.
You know, you may have some interpersonal issues, but you will not be denied housing because you are asexual. You will not be fired from your job because you're asexual. You will not be beaten to a pulp in the street because you are asexual. None of these things, hi kitty, hi kitty. None of these things will happen to you just because you're asexual. That's just not the way it works.
So let's go point by point there. We'll get to systemic discrimination in a minute, but even outside of that, asexual people are definitely discriminated against. A 2012 study reported that, in terms of prejudice, dehumanization, and discrimination, asexuals are evaluated more negatively than other sexual minorities, such as gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals. This isn't just coming from straight people either. As a whole, allosexual people in general think of asexual people as cold, animalistic, and unrestrained. This prejudice massively affects asexual people. Going back to the 2016 study, 50% of aces have contemplated suicide and 14% have attempted it. That's greater than both the general suicide attempt rate and the suicide attempt rate among LGBT youth. While this is certainly unlikely, saying that it definitely will not happen is inaccurate. It is well within legal bounds in most states. The 2012 study from earlier found, and I quote, "Following heterosexuals, participants were most willing to rent to homosexuals or asexuals and lease to bisexuals." What this means is landlords are just as likely to evict a gay person as they are an asexual person. While obviously it is a lot easier for an asexual person to simply not be out to their landlord than it would be for, say, a gay person, that still isn't exactly a solution. Being forced to stay in the closet isn't an enjoyable experience for anyone, asexual or allosexual, and if the person is out in any capacity, especially online, they run the risk of their landlord finding out and subsequently denying them their housing. Let me repeat that. The fact that ace people could pass as straight by being closeted is not a solution to their discrimination, just as much as gay people staying closeted isn't a solution to their discrimination. So yes, asexual people can be denied housing, and statistically, people are just as willing to deny housing to out asexuals as they would be to out gay people. Following the same pattern as with housing, participants were equally likely to hire a gay person as they were an asexual person, with bisexual people being seen as slightly less hireable than both of them, and heterosexual people being seen as the most hireable. And, just like with the housing, it is perfectly legal in many states to deny employment on the basis of sexual orientation. Again, we come to the argument of, well, asexual people can hide it easier than gay or bi people, and in response to that, I would just like to refer you back to the counter-argument I made like a minute ago. Frustratingly, I haven't been able to find any actual studies that delve into the physical violence suffered by asexual people. While obviously anecdotal evidence should not be viewed as holding as much weight as hard numbers, it's important to note that this lack of tangible evidence is due to the fact that asexuality has only recently started to be seen as legitimate by medical and psychological professionals. The lack of statistics here is not because there isn't any violence on which to collect them, but rather because the legitimization of asexuality is comparatively new, and these studies simply haven't been done yet. Now, let's look at some anecdotes, shall we? A Reddit user said, "An ace friend of mine was physically thrown to the ground at Manchester Pride 3 years ago for her sexuality being non-existent and attention-seeking." And a poster on Avon wrote, "I was bashed, had my ankle broken, was stabbed, was run down with a car for being who I am. Though they didn't know the term asexual, and nor did I, they did take out their hatred on me. I was never called gay or perverted, as they fully knew I just didn't understand their sexual way of thinking, but it seems that that was enough." I also have been a victim of violence due to my asexuality. I came out as asexual near the start of my junior year of high school. I lived in a very rural and very religious area, so the people there weren't exactly the most friendly towards anyone who wasn't straight and cis. In the 2 years after coming out, I was assaulted 3 separate times, twice on school grounds. Each time, the people kicking the shit out of me made it really clear why they were doing it. The first time, he waited to beat me up until after he'd spent a good few minutes yelling at me for being a cold-hearted sociopath. The second time, they both called me an asexual piece of shit at some point during the attack, and the third time some asshole sucker punched me from behind in a Walmart of all places and called me an ace freak after doing so. One part of Ren's argument here actually does hold some weight though, that being that it's unlikely that an ace person is going to get beaten up, quote, in the street. This is pretty much the only case I can think of in which aces who are straight passing legitimately do face significantly less discrimination than allossexual LGBT people. If a bigoted asshole is looking for someone to beat up, the chances that they're going to know that someone is asexual are rather slim in comparison to knowing that, say, a man holding another man's hand is probably gay. So, basically, while it is almost certainly true that ace people are significantly less likely to face random violence on the basis of their sexuality, it is definitely not true that asexual people don't face violence from people who know about their sexuality. So, Ren didn't mention this one, but it's necessary that I do. Sexual violence is a massive problem for asexual people. For your sake as well as mine, I'm not going to relay any specific anecdotes, but thankfully there is data that touches on this. In 2015, there was an asexual community census that surveyed nearly 8,000 asexual people. One of the things that this survey found was that 43.5% of asexual people have experienced sexual violence, including rape, assault, and coercion. While this survey didn't specifically ask about it, there is, anecdotally, a large prevalence of corrective rape. Essentially, a depressingly large amount of asexual assault survivors will tell you that their assault came from someone trying to, quote-unquote, fix their sexuality by forcing them into sexual acts that they were not okay with doing. There are countless stories of this that survivors have shared across Tumblr, Reddit, Twitter, and what have you, but again, I am not going to share them here.
Asexual people are not oppressed in any kind of systemic way for being asexual. They are no more oppressed than a spinster or a person who has a lot of sex.
I promised you earlier that I'd talk about systemic oppression, so here we go. I already touched on housing and employment, so those two are out of the way. Now for some other examples. So, for the most part, the rules of any given country regarding whether or not asexual people are allowed to get married are the exact same as they are for allosexuals. There are some exceptions to this rule, however. In these countries, marriage is only considered legally binding if it is consummated, which is a huge problem if you are an asexual person who doesn't have sex. On top of that, there are many countries in which a lack of consummation is grounds for annulment. It is federally legal in the US, with laws differing from state to state. For instance, both Connecticut and New Jersey permit annulment if one of the people involved is unwilling to consummate the marriage. Another example is England and Wales. Funnily enough, the Same-Sex Couples Marriage Act of 2013 explicitly excludes non-consummation as grounds for annulment, but only in the cases of same-sex marriages, so it's still illegal in quote-unquote hetero marriages. Annoyingly, I cannot for the life of me find a complete list of countries or even US states in which annulment is allowed on the grounds of non-consummation. But based on what I've been able to glean from the websites that mention it but don't give specifics, there are quite a few countries in which this is the case. Not Australia, though. They abolished that back in 1975. Guess they wanted ISIS to have a good eye down under. Sorry, got a bit carried away there. Like with the violence, there isn't really any hard data here, but I can guarantee you that you would be hard-pressed to find many asexual people who would tell you that they haven't faced discrimination from medical professionals. For some people, it can be as light as being told that's not a thing when they mention it to their doctor, but for many, it's a lot worse. Remember earlier when Calvin said he thinks asexuality is due to something in their heads? That sentiment is shared by a lot of professionals that really should know better. Countless ace people that I've spoken to have had doctors and mental health professionals alike chalk their lack of sexual attraction up to a mental disorder. To quote a Tumblr post talking about this, "My therapist asked me if I was sure that my asexuality wasn't caused by my fibromyalgia, by the pain. He suggested that I might try sex to see if it was worth pushing past the pain for. He suggested that sex would help my pain. I shot him down politely, calmly, and firmly on all of these points. In the third or fourth session, he suggested that perhaps something that happened to me in my past that I wasn't bringing up. The context was absolutely that of questioning my sexuality and implying that I must have been sexually abused when I was a child. I told him no, that nothing like that had happened to me as a child. I did not trust him, and I didn't want him to find yet another way to tell me that my ace identity was wrong and a sign that I was broken. Every therapy session was spent dissecting that part of my identity and questioning it. There was no way to get him to change the subject. I had to deal with this myself. A past therapist of mine spent 3 straight months of appointments trying to get me to admit to a sexual assault I hadn't ever experienced, as a way to explain my asexuality. The only way I was able to get him to stop talking about it was by threatening to take my money to a different therapist entirely. It's not just disrespect and invalidation, though. Some doctors and psychiatrists go so far as to prescribe medication to people to quote-unquote correct their sexuality. To quote asexual activist Sarah Beth Brooks from her interview with the Huffington Post, "A few years ago, there was nothing. There was deafening silence about asexuality. I had visited psychiatrists, doctors, I had even been on hormones." This exact same thing happened to a close friend of mine as well. When she told her doctor about not being attracted to people, that doctor prescribed her testosterone to try and fix her. That testosterone, surprise, surprise, did nothing to make her any less ace. All it did was exacerbate the dysphoria she was already experiencing as a still not out to herself trans woman. Now, one of the things that I've seen people bring up quite often is that there aren't any laws that specifically discriminate against asexual people like there are laws that discriminate against gay or trans people. While that is correct to say that aces aren't specifically discriminated against by these laws, there is, as I pointed out a bit earlier, quite a bit of overlap when it comes to just about every law that allows discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. But, yes, there aren't any laws that I could find that make it specifically illegal to identify as asexual. Even in spite of that, there is still ample evidence that asexual people are discriminated against socially as well as systematically. I don't think I've really left anything out, but you can let me know if I did in the comments. Who am I kidding? You already did. So, asexual people are, in fact, discriminated against. There are some differences that distinguish it from how that discrimination is carried out against LGBT allosexuals, but the same can be said of differences in discrimination between trans people and the rest of the LGBT community, and I don't really see many people saying trans people should be excluded as well. Well, not for the most part. So, if aces experience discrimination, why bother excluding them from the LGBT community?
A lot of people will probably say, like, well, stop gatekeeping the LGBT community. It's just like, why are they included? Like, I want to know why, like, in any way would that be the same sort of thing as gay, trans, lesbian, anything? Like, how do they have anything to do with each other? I don't really get it. I never have got it.
Now, I know I already addressed this earlier, but since I'm talking about the reasoning people give, I figured I should remind you that, according to the people with the fancy degrees and research grants, asexuality is, in fact, a legitimate sexual orientation. If you need a refresher on that info, just rewind to this time in the video.
They're hijacking resources, and they're also just being absolutely repulsive with their discourse.
I'm going to get to that bit about discourse, but first let's talk about resources. So, people claim resource hijacking quite a bit in regards to asexual inclusion, but they very, very rarely ever go into detail about what resources they're talking about. This is one of those cases. Ren says multiple times in the video that ace people are trying to take away resources, but never actually specifies what those resources would be. Thankfully, though, other people have specified. One of the most common examples people tend to give is LGBT-specific homeless shelters. Homeless shelters have a limited amount of space, and if shelters made for LGBT people allow asexual people in, then those asexuals are taking away beds from LGBT people who actually need them. So here's the problem with that. The people making this argument are usually making it in conjunction with the asexuals don't experience discrimination argument. If you actually apply the concrete evidence that ace people do actually experience discrimination, particularly the evidence regarding housing and employment, this argument completely falls apart. LGBT shelters are made specifically to cater to people who are unable to find a place to stay due to discrimination they suffer based on their gender identity or sexuality. And if you acknowledge that asexual people are just as likely to be denied a job or housing as gay people are, you kind of have to acknowledge that they belong in the LGBT shelters as well. Some other resources that ace people are apparently hijacking are money and visibility. While it is objectively true that including asexuals in the divvying up of the budgets of advocacy groups will mean less for other LGBT people, the argument that this is unwarranted doesn't really hold any water when put under scrutiny. The argument that aces don't need advocacy due to not being discriminated against is, again, debunked when you factor in the evidence that they do suffer discrimination. There is another argument, though, that being that there doesn't need to be money spent on educating people on asexuality because, after all, it's quite easy to explain the concept of someone not being sexually attracted to people, right? Well, first off, do you remember the beginning of this video where I had to clarify for Calvin what it means to be a sex-positive asexual or a demisexual? This sort of thing happens constantly. I can guarantee you that there is hardly a single ace on the entire planet who has come out as ace and not been told that asexuality isn't real, had to explain all of the particulars of asexuality, or been asked a myriad of probing and hyper-personal questions. Constantly having to explain not only that you're asexual, but also what that sexuality is absolutely exhausting. On top of that, there's the plant jokes. Dear God, so many people make the damn plant jokes. It's not funny. It's never been funny. You, the one typing that plant joke in the comments right now, you are not funny. A bit more seriously though, misinformation is a huge problem when it comes to medical care like I described earlier. Going back to that quote from Sarah Beth Brooks, a few years ago, there was nothing. There was a deafening silence about asexuality. I had visited psychiatrists, doctors, I had even been on hormones. But you know how I heard about it? I discovered it on Google. That should not be the case. If it's obscure enough that doctors and even the people who are asexual don't know what asexuality is, that means there is a severe problem with how information on asexuality has been and is being disseminated. If people were nearly as informed on asexuality as they were on, say, bisexuality, Sarah wouldn't have gone to doctors trying to figure out what was wrong with her, and my friend wouldn't have been put on hormones to cure her.
Why don't you go out and create your own space and advocacy without attaching yourself to LGBT people?
Well, the thing is, ace people have. There's AVEN, there's Asexuality Awareness Week, there's the Partnership for Asexuality Visibility and Education, there's that one documentary that was on Netflix a while back, and there are countless YouTube channels. But you know what? You could say this exact same thing about literally any other LGBT identity too. Why bother organizing into a community and advocating as a group in the first place? Why don't gay men, lesbians, pansexuals, trans people, bisexuals, and everyone else just break off into their own little separate groups and advocate for themselves on their own? Do you see why that argument doesn't really make any sense? The LGBT community is a community because it makes it easier to advocate with greater influence for a larger number of people. On top of that, being in a community makes it so that people can experience camaraderie with folks in similar situations to themselves. If you accept the research that says that asexuality is, in fact, a valid sexual orientation, and you accept the data that says that asexual people experience discrimination and oppression because of that orientation, not including them in the community that exists specifically to advocate for people who suffer discrimination as a result of their sexual orientations or gender identities, doesn't make any sense. So I did say earlier that I'd talk about the discourse Ren mentioned, so here's that.
It would be one thing if they just wanted to talk about their asexuality in a space that they felt safe in, but they demand that every space be catered to them. They go into LGBT groups and then they get angry and demand content warnings and trigger warnings for LGBT couples kissing and showing affection and love. So in a group, in a movement that is, by design, necessarily trying to liberate people's sexuality, you are trying to undermine that and make them cater to you and your level of discomfort.
So here's the thing. I 100% agree with Ren that this should not be happening. Asexual people, myself included, should not try and suppress sexual expression in LGBT spaces that include allosexual people. As Ren said, the movement is centered around sexual liberation, and it is a bad move to try and remove that liberation from others. That being said, I do think that it is quite a good practice to, when possible, include spaces and subgroups within communities, allosexual and asexual alike, that are specifically sexual content free. Why? Well, sexual assault survivors exist, and children exist, and sex-repulsed asexuals exist. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those make Pride kid-friendly people. At most, I may try to make a designated area of Pride kid-friendly person, and there's a pretty strong difference there. So there, Ren was right. Asexual people trying to demand that, as a whole, spaces including allosexual LGBT folks should be made devoid of any and all sexual expression is a very bad thing. However, I do disagree with the notion that there shouldn't be some LGBT spaces that are free of that, if not necessarily for the sake of asexuals, at least for the sake of minors and survivors of sexual assault. Thankfully, though, I don't think there's really anyone that would disagree with that. So, in conclusion, asexuality is actually a sexuality. Asexual people do, in fact, experience discrimination. Asexual people are subject to a lot of types of systematic oppression. Taking these points into account, there isn't really any reason to not allocate some resources to asexual advocacy and awareness. Saying that aces should just make their own group doesn't really make any sense. And while spaces shouldn't be made entirely free of sexual expression, it's generally a good idea to have some spaces that are free of it. Include asexuals in the LGBT community. There is no reason not to unless you just like gatekeeping for the fun of it. And if that accurately describes you, maybe you should self-reflect on why that might be. So yeah, that's all I got. Huge thanks to Stacey Vatemi and Jonas MacArthur for their help with the script. I've linked Stacey's channel and Jonas's website in the description. Please like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. I've also got a Patreon going on, so if you want to extra super support my videos, you can find a link to that in the description. I'd like to give a special thanks to Antonio Oliver for being part of the illustrious Sunflower Seed tier. If you'd like to have your name in the credits, be it textually or said out loud, you can become a patron yourself and join us in the beautiful, tranquil sunflower field. I've got a GoFundMe campaign going on because I've got a genetic tissue disorder that makes my joints dislocate all the time, and I'm also trans, and both of those things entail quite a lot of medical costs. So if you could donate, signal boost the campaign, or even just share this video, that'd mean the world to me. If you were wondering why there was a skull on the screen, I mentioned earlier that I was emulating the YouTuber Sean. He makes really, really good stuff. I linked his channel in the description. Go check him out. So, on the off chance that you're both still an exclusionist and you bothered watching this far in the video, and you really want to dislike it or leave an angry comment, please feel free to do either of those things. Just so you know though, I am going to be moderating the comment section for civility. That doesn't mean I'm going to be removing dissenting opinions, as I really do welcome those, but if you're gonna get vitriolic or personally attack myself or anyone else, your comment's gonna get removed. Anyways, that's all I got. Have a nice day, and sit up straight in your chair. It's better for your back.